And let's warmly welcome Susan Easton. Susan is true champion of women in entrepreneurship. She served as a president of Women Entrepreneurs. She was also with other organizations dedicated to entrepreneurship. She's a receiver of a Templeton Award, also other awards. She's published. She is author of a number of books about women in entrepreneurship. She's an advocate of freedom, and her today's speech will be also associated to the question of women as liberty fighters, entrepreneurs, and changers of the environment. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. I don't talk quite as fast as he does, which is probably a good thing. I want to begin my talk today by honoring my grandmother. Her name was Anna Dora Sakowska, and she was born up north near the Lithuanian border in Suwałki, Poland. She came to America in 1910. Her father was a fairly prosperous farmer, and he had several children, including her elder brother, Alexander. And so they were tired of the Russian occupation of their country, and my great-grandfather could see World War I coming, so the family history goes, and he decided to send his children to America to be free. So Alexander came first, and he started a farm in, of all places, Saginaw, Michigan, where I still have distant relatives. And a year later, in 1910, my grandmother, Anna Dora, and her sister-in-law, Alexander's wife, Eva, came over with Eva's and Alexander's two little girls. So they took the ship across the Atlantic Ocean, and they got to Ellis Island, and sadly, the two little girls got sick on the ship, and they died. They never got off Ellis Island. They may have seen the Statue of Liberty, I don't know. But a year or so ago, we found their graves. There was a graveyard in Queens, New York, Donald Trump country. And they buried all of the immigrants who died on Ellis Island who didn't have any family or identity papers. So we found their graves, and we were astonished to find the names of the two girls, one of which is Juliana. What's interesting about that is one of my cousins, another of Anna's grandchildren, Jeff, had three daughters, and his middle daughter, he gave the middle name Dora to in honor of our great-granny. And we found out when we found the girls' graves that one of them was actually named Juliana, which is my cousin's daughter's first name. So she's actually named after two of her Polish relatives, and she never knew it until about 2 years ago, which I think is really amazing. So, and after this, we're going to go up there and poke around, and I was just told yesterday that Suwałki is known as the North Pole of Poland, so I'm glad it's summer. Now, for centuries, historians have debated the very existence of an ancient group of, I skipped a page, hang on, Terry's going to get confused. By the way, Anna had 13 children. My mother was the middle of the 13, so I have lots of relatives. And just last week, a new great-grandson of Anna's was born in Baltimore, Maryland. So, ladies who advocated and fought for women have never had an easy time of it. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of Mary Wollstonecraft, which is a great last name. She wrote in 1792 an essay called A Vindication of Women's Rights. And I have since learned that when she wrote it and put it out for publication, her neighbors started gossiping about her and saying that she had a mental illness problem. There are also, I found, 4 waves of feminism. If you're into history or you like the sociological patterns, you can look up the 4 waves of feminism. They have their own wiki page, of course. Not here to talk about that. But until the mid-20th century, celebrating women and lifting their achievements up wasn't a recognized field of study. And now American universities and colleges have women's studies departments. The problem is that in America, about 90 to 95% of college professors identify themselves as liberal. It's a different kind of liberal than we were hearing used yesterday. Liberal has now been kind of taken over by the Democrat Party and the Democrat Socialists, and they consider themselves liberal, whereas the Republicans are the conservatives. So liberal and progressive, that's the other code word for being sort of left-wing sympathizers. So imagine this, you send your kid to a college and you're paying $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year, and all that happens is they hear left-wing propaganda, just like in economics departments we've been hearing about. So the reason I gave my title, gave the talk the title that I did, Women Warriors, is I just watched a 4-part program on one of the television networks, and it was called Women Warriors. And there were 4 different episodes, and the 4 different groups that they profiled were Scythian women, Japanese samurai women warriors, women gladiators, and African tribal women who were both chiefs and spies, trained spies. Now, what's interesting is that this is one of the books I recommend if you want a funny kind of take on American history, or women's history and through the ages. So for centuries, historians debated the very concept about were there such things as Amazon women. There were people who argued about pottery, and are these women, did they cut off one breast to be better archers? I mean, there's all kinds of wacky stuff out there, but historians could not even agree that there were such things as women warriors. So a few years ago, some archaeologists started digging up what were called kurgans, K-U-R-G-A-N-S, or burial mounds. And these were in the Mongolian steppes, and I know we have some friends here from Mongolia. And they found some bones of women in these burial mounds, and what was amazing was they knew they were women because they have DNA testing now. And they analyzed what was in the burial mounds, and they discovered that these women were in fact buried with equal honors as the male warriors in their tribes. And they knew that because they were buried with their bows and arrows and all sorts of other ceremonial things. And sometimes, if they also died in battle, their horses. And these women were also accused of giving away their children, not wanting to be mothers. And the thing about that was that in order to prevent intertribal warfare, these women gave up their sons and gave them to other tribes to be raised. So there's a whole different vision now that we have about the most ancient women warriors. And I'm talking about women who were around in 300 BC. Also, news to me, women gladiators. Now everybody remembers Russell Crowe all beefcaked up in the movie Gladiators. Well, it turns out that there were a lot of women gladiators, and they were mostly slaves. And if they survived the one-on-one, hand-to-hand brutal combat in the arenas, they won their freedom, which I think is pretty amazing. And women samurais, the same, and these African tribal women who were trained to be spies, they would infiltrate other neighboring tribes and bring back intelligence, and they were able to take over the property and conquer the other tribes and take their riches. So, as I said, Uppity Women are the 2 books by Vicki Leon, and they're very, very funny. Each page is a different woman of history, and she captures their whole moods and all the tricky and sneaky and uppity things they did to survive in their various time periods. So, like my grandmother, there are also lots of women who went across the continents, especially American women, to settle new lands. We know about the British suffragettes, who suffered terrible, terrible treatment in British jails so that women could get the vote. And we also have photos and film footage of women who served in wars and women who went into space and have been elected to office, all of those things. You name it, women have done it. There's even a story, because I am a theologian, about Pope Joan. I don't know if you've ever heard about her. She was supposedly a really educated, very bright woman who managed to pass herself off as a man and actually got elected Pope. And the only reason she was outed was she unfortunately gave birth in a papal procession one afternoon. And since then, by the way, there is a chair, and every candidate for Pope has to sit on the chair and let things dangle, as it were, to make sure he's not a fake. So, also, I gave a talk in 1998 to a group of Lutheran women, and they said, we've had all these serious debates and topics about AIDS and homelessness and all that. Could you do something kind of funnier? And I said, you want theology light? And they said, yes. And I said, well, what did you have in mind? And they said, well, Martin Luther came along, these are all Lutherans, and in that neck of the woods. And she said, I'd like to do something where we learn about women saints, because Martin Luther kind of decommissioned the saints, and so they didn't know about their heritage, about the stories of women saints. So I prepared this talk, And I gave them the proposal, and the lady looked at the title and it said, maybe it's not your hormones, maybe you're a saint. And she came back to me and she said, I love the proposal, but could you change the title because Lutheran women don't talk about hormones? So I changed the title and I said, don't listen to your critics, maybe you're a saint, which is one of the points I'll use to conclude. So since this is the Freedom and Entrepreneurship group, I wanted to talk a little bit more about my experiences as an entrepreneur. And here's how that story goes. In 1975, we moved to San Francisco and we rented an apartment. And our apartment landlady lived upstairs, so a 3-story building. And she said, I just joined a group of 11 women who are all entrepreneurs, and I'm running for president. I want to be the first president of this little group. And I think if you join and vote for me as the 13th member, I'll win and I'll be the first president. So I said, well, the problem is I don't actually own a business right now. And she said, well, give me $500 and you can tell people that you run the design department of my studio. So I thought, well, it's a great way to meet new people. So I gave her a check for $500. I went to the first meeting. I joined Women Entrepreneurs. We all had the election and lost, and she never came back to the group again. But I figured I was out $500 and I was, new in town, so I stayed in the group. And I volunteered to start the newsletter. And we had some friends who were in the newsletter business, so I kind of knew how newsletters work. And I started the Women Entrepreneurs newsletter called Prospectus. And this started a whole new kind of revolutionary period in women's entrepreneurship in San Francisco and ultimately all over the U.S. The thing that was kind of amusing was a year later I was nominated for president and I won, and our landlady didn't really speak to us much after that. When I took office, there were 70 members of Women Entrepreneurs after that first year and a half or so. By the time I left, there were 370 members. And nobody knew that there were that many women entrepreneurs. Nobody had ever bothered to count them in San Francisco or any place else probably. And we decided this is pre-internet, this is kind of a historical background for you younger women who can't imagine what it was like to function without the internet. But our executive committee decided that one of the ways we could help one another and help drum up business as well was we printed a little booklet, not, kind of like really flimsy paper this size, and it was a directory of all of our businesses and services. And we had women agree to put a little asterisk next to their names if they were willing to be mentors to other women who wanted to start their own businesses. And we printed up stacks and stacks of them, and all 370 members took stacks and stacks of these things, and they put them in their shops, they put them in their offices, wherever. They handed them out to their neighbors, and suddenly within 2 or 3 months, all of them started reporting a really big increase in business. So we thought, well, we're on a roll. So I volunteered to do, because I'm a writer basically, I volunteered to do articles about the women in the group, and I submitted them to the local San Francisco Business Journal. And after 4 articles, they said, could you do this every week? We'd really like you to be a regular columnist, which was my first columnist job. And we did, and it was a lot of fun. We started hosting events, and all of a sudden, I started to think, maybe I should start a national newsletter for women who own their own businesses. And I looked around, did my homework, and I found out there already was one called Artemis for Enterprising Women. She was the goddess of the hunt, Artemis. And I thought, well, and it's based in New York, boy, those New Yorkers, they're kind of tough to deal with. I'm going to have to, play it cool. So I created Women Entrepreneur Stationery. We didn't have any up till then. And I wrote a letter to the lady who was the founder of the New York Association of Women Business Owners and also this newsletter. And I said, I'm really interested. We're out here in California. We'd love to see copies of your newsletter. And I expected some sort of uppity reply from the New York lady, but she was very gracious, and she wrote back and she said, I knew you were out there somewhere. And she said, I'd love to meet with you. And we exchanged a few phone calls and things. And I sent her samples of my writing, and she said, I know you would make a great West Coast manager. You could interview all those women on your side of the country, and it would be wonderful. She said, and oh, by the way, I've organized the first ever Women in Business Week in New York, and I think you should come. So I flew overnight the next week, and I slept for a couple of hours, got up, got dressed, went to this really posh hotel, and she was waiting for me in the lobby, and she said, "You're Susan." I said, "You're Ava." And she said, "Yes." And we shook hands. And she literally twirled me around 180 degrees. And the next thing I knew, I was shaking the hand of the mayor of New York at the time, Abe Beam. And she said, "This is my West Coast business partner." Okay. Which I became. And that was a lot of fun. And we had great adventures. We really did. We interviewed the most fabulous women. And I enjoyed every minute of it. It was just fabulous. Meanwhile, I was introduced to another woman in San Francisco, and her name was Joan. And Joan was an executive recruiter, a headhunter, as they call them. And she said that all of these women were interviewing with her company because they thought they wanted to work for corporations. And all these corporations were interviewing Joan because they thought they wanted to hire women, because hiring working women in the 1970s was a really big deal. And several newspapers and magazine articles said, "Oh, the rise in the number of working women in America is the biggest phenomenon in the society and the culture that we've ever experienced. It's just changing the whole way the country works." So I was really inspired by that. And the problem was that we didn't really know how to reach out to even more people. So Ava decided that by the time I was working with Joan, we decided that we were going to write a book, and it was going to be called Equal to the Task. And, well, ended up being Equal to the Task. We wanted it to be called Femnomenon, because it was a play on words, and we were actually told, that that sounded too much like a name that you made up to sell books, which I thought was interesting. We found out later that the book publishing company which bought our proposal was Seaview Press, which was then a wholly owned subsidiary of Playboy. So I get to tell men I was a literary bunny. And if they ask what that means, I tell them I didn't have a staple in my navel, I had perfect binding. So I was working with Joan and another woman on the book, and then Ava decided that we should try to take Enterprising Women, the newsletter, into a magazine format, which is this, and which was the previous slide, actually. And it was really great. The problem was, you can't just start a magazine. You need advertising, and you need all kinds of other support mechanisms. So we went out looking for seed money, and the only seed money we were offered was from a woman named Betty Graham. I don't know how many of you remember liquid paper, sometimes called whiteout. Betty Graham was a secretary who made an incredible number of typing mistakes in her job. And her boss was always making her correct all of the contracts and the letters and things. And back then, all they had was carbon paper copies. You'd put a piece of carbon paper between two sheets of paper, and correcting mistakes was virtually impossible. So she said there must be another way, and she went out in her garage in Texas and started experimenting and finally came up with liquid paper. And this made her, over the years before we met her, a couple of $1 million, which was really great. And she found out about Enterprising Women wanting to be a magazine, so she gave us $50,000 to create this sample issue. I just was looking at it again yesterday, and it's amazing what we were doing back then. I was amused by the fact that one of the headline on the cover stories was, "Energy businesses you can start." So even back in the 70s, that was going on. Now here was the problem. So we had this wonderful slick looking preview issue, and we did have some companies like MasterCard support us with some temporary ads. But then you had to go to Madison Avenue in New York, where all the advertising agencies were, and you had to convince them that telling their clients, their corporate clients, to advertise in a magazine for working women was going to be a profitable idea, that there were enough people who would buy this magazine. And they kept saying, "I don't think so. I just don't think so." Next thing we knew, after we were turned down by just every ad agency on Madison Avenue, it was very discouraging, suddenly the New York Times published an article that appeared on the front page of the New York Times, and it said, "For the first time ever, the US government has collected statistics on how many women-owned businesses there are in America." And it was such big news. I mean, front page of the Sunday New York Times, 250,000 women-owned businesses. This is 1976, 77, something like that. And these were a couple of year old statistics. So even with that information, they said, "Oh, 250,000 people, you know, that's not really, how many are going to subscribe? And it's just not profitable." So we gave up on the idea of doing the magazine. And another company had started a magazine for working women, and it's called Working Woman. And they were getting more pull because of all the women in corporate America. So we sold out our subscriber base, and we went our ways, Ava and I, to do different things. Well, President Carter at the time had also seen this article in the New York Times, and he thought it was phenomenal too. So he decided to sign an executive order and create the Women's Enterprise Task Force, which sounds like a really great idea. I mean, he got the Small Business Administration in America to have a special office for women. There was a director of women's small businesses and all that sort of thing. And there was a lot of big press, and there were press conferences, and there were conferences held all over the country. Of course, what that meant was all these people were being sent out from Washington, D.C., spending our tax dollars to stay in hotels and tell women it was a really great idea to start your own business, but not really doing much of anything else to help them, except offer them, kind of wave this little carrot in front of them, would you like to have a government contract? And of course, anytime the bureaucracy offers you anything like that, run like hell. Ava and I actually looked at one of the contracting proposals once, and she was tearing her hair out. She said, this is ridiculous, this form you have to fill out to get a government contract. And I said, Ava, calm down. It was probably designed by a man, so she understood. So while I said kind of goodbye to Ava for a while, Joan and I and our other co-author, Diane, went off and we started doing interviews for Equal to the Task. And we made a very fateful decision along the way. We decided that we would kind of look at it like a Margaret Mead report on American society and culture, and we would interview men as if they were equal victims of cultural change and confusion. And we had a code, actually. If one of the guys we were interviewing, we said, oh, women in the workforce, best thing since sliced bread, we'd say, what was it that made you a feminist? And that was going to be our trick question to see what they would answer. The first guy we interviewed who said, oh yeah, I'm really very much for equality and women in the workforce. And we said, well, what was it that made you a feminist? And he paused and he said, well, in the space of 1 year, my best friend, who was a father of 3 boys, declared that he was going to have a sex change operation, and my girlfriend left me for another woman. And I decided it was time to reevaluate my definitions of male and female. So, needless to say, we endeavored. We had some wonderful interviews with men. I remember one guy, he had his office door open, and his secretary was sitting out front. We turned out to be his sister-in-law, and we said, and what was it that made you a feminist? He said, well, mostly it's the women I've slept with. I was like, wow, that was a long time. So we went ahead, we published the book, and it came out in 1983, and it had all these interviews and kind of nice things to say about men, and we suddenly realized that we were getting blacklisted by women's groups. They'd say things like, well, we really can't fit you into our schedule, we don't want you to come and talk about your book and promote it, because men are not our friends. And by that time, the feminist movement had gotten really sort of radical and tough and very left-wing. And the National Association of Women, which had been started in 1966-67 as a real women's rights and equality organization, kind of had gotten totally radicalized in a lot of ways. And it was not just bra burning, it was like they wanted to take men out and lynch them. They were really, really hardcore. So we weren't getting any support for our book from the National Organization for Women either. And we suddenly realized that there was a whole change in society yet again, and that was the issue of what was happening to feminism at the time. And it seemed like we fractionalized into 2 kind of groups. And so when we were blacklisted and blackballed by all these women's groups, Joan and Diane and I started our own. And it didn't really have a name, but we met in a restaurant that was named after the 4 great robber barons who founded California. And it's called the Big 4 Restaurant, so I guess we were just the Big 4 group. But it was wonderful. We got to meet other women who, like us, didn't feel like we had to burn our bras or march in the streets or castrate all men and all the things that they wanted. I mean, there was some crazy stuff going on at that time. That was actually a proposal somebody made. You should put like saltpeter in all their food or something. I don't know. So we decided we weren't going to do that. And it was very successful, and we met for months and months and months. And for all I know, there's still groups that are meeting there. And we had just an amazing time. President Carter, meanwhile, got kind of caught up in something called the Iran hostage crisis. He sort of lost interest in helping women entrepreneurs. So, skip ahead here. Want to make sure I get everything in. And so recently, I read a book. We're involved with a lot of different organizations. One of them is the Independent Institute, which is in Oakland, California, which is a very libertarian organization. And they publish lots of really fabulous books. You can get online for free and sign up for their newsletter called The Lighthouse. And Liberty for Women is one of their most recent books, and the subtitle is Freedom and Feminism in the 21st Century. And one of the essays in it is by a college professor named Camille Paglia, P-A-G-L-I-A. She's been a professor for 30 years, and she's an open lesbian, but that doesn't make much difference. But she's definitely a libertarian who tends to lean to the left in some issues, but she's a really good, clear thinker, and she's very outspoken. What amazed me about this little essay on Liberty for Women, by the way, I'm leaving a copy of this with our hosts here, so that ladies in Poland can come and visit and read or maybe borrow it. In the essay, Camille talks about what happened to her in the 1990s. She came out and there were all these anti-pornography feminists. They said, you know, this was degrading to women. And Camille once made the comment that she was pro-sex. And they took that the wrong way, and they really just trashed her. And she also said what we did, that men were not the natural enemies of women, that we had to learn how to cooperate and keep families together. And by then, the National Organization for Women just was tying itself into knots. On one hand, it would go out in all of its branches and all the television shows and things and say that they were anti-discrimination, they were pro-women, they thought that women's equality was the most important issue and that sexual harassment in the workplace was the worst possible thing. And at the same time, they were supporting Bill Clinton after he had been outed as the sexual predator. And they didn't say one word, not one press release, not one woman, and now broke ranks and stood up and said, and yeah, we have a sexual predator in the White House, you know. And they said no, they were so loyal to the party and the party principles that they just couldn't actually see that they were making themselves look like hypocrites. So that was where feminism came into what I call feminism's identity crisis. And the article here is really great. It's in an issue of The Atlantic from '93. And I love this. Little Miss Muffet is sitting on her tuffet, and the spider that comes down is in the shape of the male gender symbol. So I thought that was kind of cute. Paglia also presented her arguments for what women's libertarian feminists should be focused on. And one of them was the redesign of educational programs for Western women, because she said they're not being prepared for leadership. And I refer back to these women's studies departments. If you have a chance and you want to have either a laugh or a cry, read some of the programs that are being offered. I came up with one last week that I saw in an article that just made me fall out laughing. It said that this was a feminist history course in this women's studies department, and the professor was giving, you ready, extra credit for women who would let the hair grow under their armpits. Now, how that prepares you to be a woman leader, I don't know, and I don't know if any men were auditing the course, and if they were, what did they do for extra credit, one wonders. But she also talks a lot about getting out there to focus on the reason women need to be better leaders, Western women, is they have a lot of rights and they have a lot of opportunities, whereas a lot of the rest of the women in the world don't. And I don't know if you know this, but before she became the Duchess of Sussex recently, Meghan Markle actually did volunteer with an organization that went out to countries in Africa where lots of young girls are kept at home when they're having their periods because it's still considered something shameful and terrible, and so they don't go to school, and some of them, once they stop going, are not allowed or just never go back. And the problem with that is that, of course, every year of schooling that they don't get decreases their ultimate earning potential over their lives, and it just doesn't help the societies move forward. So that's the kind of programs that need to be lifted up, and good for the Duchess on that one. I think that's one of the things that Harry loved about her, that she loved Africa and she was out there on the trail doing social activism.
What was her product?
I can't, you can look it up. It's in her bio. It's
What feminine product?
It's a feminine product. Let's just leave it at that. I don't know which company sponsored it. Also, Paglia said that we need to look at agriculture. And I thought, agriculture? What does that have to do with femininity or equal rights? And it turns out that research shows that when women are in control of agricultural lands, income levels, health, and educational opportunities increase in the society. The problem, as Paglia notes, is that as far as the statistic takers are concerned, only 20% of the land in the whole world is controlled by women. So we need more lady farmers like my granny. Another statistic she mentions, which I found really shocking, is that more than two-thirds of the 796 million illiterate people in the world are women. And so here we are in this wonderful place, reading books, hearing talks, but 796 million people are illiterate, and two-thirds of that number are women. So on the way here, I saw an article in the New York Times, which kind of blew me away, talking about equality. There are only 24 women left in America who are CEOs of major companies, and it's declining. They expect 3 more to either retire or quit in the next year or so. So even after this huge push and this great drive to get women into the corporate boardrooms, they're giving up and they're leaving and they're quitting. It's just not working for some reason, at different reasons for different women. But I find that a kind of interesting statistic, very negative. But I have to say that there is good news. After being dismissed as a minority group, Ava and I and our entrepreneurs, of 250,000, now there are 2 magazines, at least, maybe more, and including things like Forbes. Forbes features a lot of articles now about women entrepreneurs. Found out that the most successful women entrepreneur that's getting press right now is named Sarah Blakely. She was profiled in Forbes magazine. She started out as a door-to-door fax saleswoman. Now I can't imagine how you do that. Door-to-door faxing. And now she owns the first women-owned company by anyone's measurement that's worth $1 billion. So she's a self-made billionaire, and her company is Spanx. That's an athletic clothing company. And on the whole, where we started out with those 250,000 women registered and recognized in 1976, there are now, according to 2016 statistics, 11.6 million women-owned businesses in America. I'm really proud to tell you that. And of these businesses, these companies employ 9 million people, and they earn an estimated $11.7 trillion collectively. So I think that's a wonderful surge forward for women entrepreneurs. Worldwide, I also can tell you that 1/3 of all businesses in the world are now owned by women. So things are looking up in lots of ways, and I'd like to leave you with that happy thought. And I hope to see all of you young ladies someday, young women, running your own corporations and sending me your cards. So what do I want you to take away from my talk today? First of all, start with honoring the women in your personal lives and the history of the women who have done things for you. Some of them you may not know, but you can read about them. And this is another one of the women's magazines that came out. They're now doing feature magazines about the most successful women. There's one that I saw a couple of months ago, and about 90% of the women in the magazine were all liberal Democrats. That's interesting. Anyway, so honor the women in your lives and the history of your nations who have done brave and noble things to advance all of us further along the road to freedom. Don't always listen to your critics, like I learned talking to that Lutheran lady who didn't like hormones. Remember the great words of Eleanor Roosevelt, the World War II era US president's wife, who said famously, "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." That's a great quote. Join forces with like-minded people and find ways to encourage and support one another. This is especially true for people who start and operate small businesses, and the internet here has had an incredible impact on networking. If you just do a Google search on women entrepreneurs, the amazing amount of articles that come up now, just on all different topics, and one of them is this whole networking option. The other one is to remember that, like my topic that I used for the women's group, the Lutheran women, maybe you're a saint, and what I mean by that, or a goddess of the gaps, as I use in my title. I think we can all agree that spreading the messages of freedom and liberty are holy mission. So think of yourself as a goddess or God. I don't want to be too sexist for that. But, you know, it is a holy mission, what we're doing. And if you have faith in your vision, some ideas are ahead of their time, some are right on time, and some may be the wrong timing altogether. Wait out conditions if you can, but be prepared to move along like Ava and I had to another more achievable goal, and then you can come back and revisit things later, maybe. If you're going to be part of a movement, make sure it is one which advocates for freedom from government interventions and controls. Avoid bureaucrats and collectivists whenever possible, and for God's sake, call men out when they need to be called out. The Me Too movement has gone a little over the top, but I mean, I think that when Now didn't speak out against Clinton, it sent a terrible message across the board. And then keep an eye out for both good and bad news that can help you. Sometimes I read so much bad news I want to bury my head in the sand. So you have to go out and look for good news, and that's why I look up statistics about women entrepreneurs. Terry sometimes calls me, it's an old cartoon I found in a New Yorker, and it's a guy sitting at a table and he's got stacks and stacks and stacks of papers and books, and underneath it just says freelance trend spotter. So you have to become your own freelance trend spotter, and I'm sure that's how Sarah Blakely ended up making $1 billion in athletic clothes. So last but not least, remember, well-behaved women rarely make history, so you know, don't be afraid to make a little noise. And finally, many of you have no doubt come to this conference with an ongoing project in operation, or in your head, or in your heart. And others of you may just find a vision while you're here, networking with people, talking about options and ideas. So seek out people, continue to do it, continue to spread the word, bring more people to conferences like this. And I hope that whatever you try, you stay true to what you learn here, and that you remember you are not alone. Never forget that you are living your own story, and storytelling, as Terry mentioned, is a really important aspect of being a freedom fighter. You have to get out there and tell the stories. As a matter of fact, the Atlas Network in New York just released a new report called Rebranding Liberty. And what they're doing is they're focusing on getting people to tell stories. There's a whole section on storytelling, which I found really inspiring. And never forget, you're living your own story right now, right here, in this building, with these people. You're another part of your story. So take good notes, because someday I would like to be sitting out there while one of you is standing up here, and I'll be happy to be in your audience anytime. And thanks to my technician.
We have 2 minutes left.
Nah, that's okay.
One question?
One question? I don't know.
You can take one question.
Okay.
Oh, so
Okay,
I just have a quick question. So what would be better about lazy farmers? Is there a mechanism behind the statistics?
Isn't that, I found that fascinating as well. It's a World Bank statistic, I believe, and I guess that women just have a better sense of the land and the property. I don't know, maybe they're not as crazy as males running farms, but I guess gentle lady farmers are more profitable and more productive. I'll find out for you, though. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you so much, Susan. Once again, bravo.
Thank you.